And for me, skillful mourning is the intentional work of mourning that I do every day. So when I say skillful, intentional mourning, what I mean is that I set aside time in my practice to mourn. In a way, when I do that, it's kind of like regulating and managing the energy of grief, which is what I'm touching into, the grief, which is a part of the brokenheartedness.
Hello and welcome, everyone. Today, I'm very excited to be in conversation with one of the leaders of the next generation of Dharma teachers, Lama Rod Owens. Rod is an author, activist, and Buddhist teacher in the Kagyu School of Tibetan Buddhism. Today, his talk is called The Dharma of Collective Resiliency. It's my hope that after our conversation, you'll walk away with a clear understanding of the importance of collective resiliency, the necessity of mourning, what balance looks like, and how to sustain it. Welcome, Lama Rod. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey, for having me. And thank you to Sounds True for hosting this really important summit. Again, my name is Lama Rod Owens, and I am, among many things, a Dharma teacher. And depending on who you ask, I may be a lot of other things as well. But we're not going to get into that in this talk. That's another talk that we can do later. But the Dharma of collective resiliency, trauma has become such an important topic for me. And I never identified as someone who experienced trauma or even knew what trauma was until perhaps the summer of 2014. And that was the summer of Michael Brown, who was shot in Missouri. And I remember experiencing, that whole period really in such a numb, shut down, paranoid, hyper sensitive way. And I was just it was so interesting to actually move through that experience, having all of these reactions. And that was also the summer when Israel was bombing the Gaza Strip. So I remember moments where, watching the news, I would flip back, between, Michael Brown and, everything that was happening in the Middle East. And I remember very specifically, it felt like when I saw this bombing, I felt like I was being bombed. I felt a very visceral experience, of being the target of violence. And I got super curious about that. I got super curious, and I just started really just exploring and reading and asking questions and sitting with friends. As some of you know, that was also the period in which Radical Dharma emerged with my colleague and friend, Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams. That was one of the reasons we were interacting so intimately, and that was because I was having, this experience, which was, pretty much PTSD, and I needed someone to really talk with, to explore these things with. And our conversations were the foundation for what would later be called Radical Dharma. And since Radical Dharma, I really used Radical Dharma, the book, to really explore my relationship to trauma. And since then, I've been able to really deepen my work around trauma. And, the thing about trauma that I'm really, really interested in is how we're able to practice what I call collective resiliency, and so I can have these experiences of shutting down, these experiences of kind of being trapped in certain cycles of reactivity. But I wonder how I can rely not just on my effort to work through those, those experiences, but to rely on the community, my collective around me, you know, and I am descendant from slaves, you know, I'm descendant, you know, from people who really struggled within these systems of oppression, you know, like racism and so forth. And I've inherited a certain experience of what I call transhistorical trauma, you know. But what I've also inherited from my ancestry is transhistorical resiliency, you know. And for me, resiliency is the work that we do to continue moving through our lives, you know. As my teachers falling down and getting back up again. And that teaching has deeply influenced my understanding of resiliency. And for me, further, resiliency is about, you know, this experience of feeling restored, balanced, connected. It's this feeling of being at home within my body, within my mind, within the totality of my experience. It's the ways in which I am able to hold space for my discomfort, for my trauma, for my woundedness. I use a term called brokenheartedness. So resiliency for me, ultimately, is the way in which I hold the space for the experience of my broken heart, you know. And my broken heart is an expression, well, it's a collective expression of various forms of suffering and discomfort. Sometimes I call it pain, sometimes I call it woundedness, sometimes it's called trauma, sometimes it's called disappointment, you know, but it's this really intense feeling of deep, deep disappointment, deep, deep disruption, deep, deep lack of feeling held or taken care of. And that's what I call brokenheartedness. And so my practice of resiliency is actually about holding space for this brokenheartedness. And this brokenheartedness, the way that which I hold space is actually by noticing this experience of a broken heart and not reacting, you know? And it's about, for me in my practice, leaning back and allowing this energy of the broken, you know, to give it its space to be there. It's also about a profound expression of love, which for me in this case is a really direct kind of acceptance. Like I accept this deep brokenheartedness, which sometimes feels like trauma, you know? So it's about accepting. It's not, and when I say accepting, it's not about condoning, it's not about celebrating, it's not about being happy. About accepting means I tell myself the truth in the moment. And the truth in the moment is that I am experiencing this thing that's really uncomfortable. And I just allow myself to experience it. That's it, right? It's not about thinking about it, it's not about analyzing, but it's about experiencing within the space that I'm able to offer. So one could say that I'm actually feeding this experience of the broken heart, and I feed it space, right? And that space is generated from the work of not reacting, not judging, you know? And it's inspired, or it's further driven by the ways in which I don't want anything from it. You know, I don't want to run away from it, nor am I actually interested in running into it. I'm just interested in allowing it to be in my experience, right? You know, and so one of the things that I really have found to be an important part of my practice is the practice of mourning, you know? And so mourning is the work of allowing my brokenheartedness to rise in my experience, you know? That is the heart in my practice. That's the heart of resiliency, is the mourning. It's the touching into the broken heart, allowing the broken heart to move through my experience. I believe in what I call skillful mourning. And for me, skillful mourning is the intentional work of mourning that I do every day. So when I say skillful, intentional mourning, what I mean is that I set aside time in my practice to mourn, and in a way, when I do that, it's kind of like regulating and managing the energy of grief, which is what I'm touching into, the grief, which is a part of the brokenheartedness. I intentionally open up to it. And I just don't open up to it, just like this. Like I create a container to hold me, and one of the main containers that I use is called the 7 homecomings. And I have a very formal practice that I use when I'm working with groups and we're exploring really heavy energy like trauma and brokenheartedness. The 7 homecomings, it's based upon the traditional Buddhists going for refuge practice. But in the 7 homecomings, I take the traditional 3 sources of refuge and I expand it to 7. And this expansion is a reflection of the things in my life that I value and feel as if I need as a source of refuge. Not just the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, but also my lineage, my ancestors, the earth. I need silence. And the 7th homecoming is actually myself, right? So I am the one at the end of the day coming home to myself. Like I have to come home to myself for any of this to be effective, for any of this to be an effective container to hold the work of mourning, right? In our practice later, at the end of this short presentation, we're just going to do an abbreviated version, of the 7 homecomings that you can use in your own practice. When I skillfully mourn, I practice these skills that I take off the cushion into the world, and I use them when I'm actually encountering situations where the grief and the heartbrokenness is being triggered. I call upon my sources of refuge. I call them into the space and I let them hold me as I imagine opening my heart to this really difficult energy, this really difficult energy of brokenheartedness. And I allow that energy just to kind of move through me to be held by my sources of refuge. I think one of the things that we struggle with, particularly as individuals and also as collectives or as communities, is the ways in which we don't allow ourselves to mourn. So we don't actually cultivate the space within our lives or within community or collective spaces for people to actually move through this energy, and the example that I give is this, sometimes, when we're, meeting someone, we run into someone and we say, oh, how are you? Like, how are you doing? And always, probably 90% of the time, many of us respond by saying, oh, fine, I'm fine, I'm okay, busy, I'm tired, blah, 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 but I'm fine, I'm okay, and then you just keep moving, right? And for me, that is one of the ways in which we bypass each other's discomfort. It's a kind of social ritual play that we engage in, and the message of that play is that we're not actually interested in how anyone feels, but we really want to be nice to people, but that niceness isn't an expression of compassion, right? Compassion means that we are doing the work of tuning into our own discomfort, and that tuning into our own discomfort actually allows us to tune into the discomfort of others, right? But when we're just trying to be nice, we're just actually not interested in tuning into discomfort. We're interested in getting out of here as fast as possible because we have other things to do. And quite frankly, we just don't have the time for someone to tell us their sob story. We have our own sob story. Like, we don't want to put our sob stories together because we won't survive that, And I think that if we could just revisit and come back to what authentic compassion is, we begin to understand that authentic compassion is actually a source of refuge for us. You know, it's a source of refuge that is capable of holding space, not just for our discomfort, but the discomfort of others. You know, it begins to, when we practice authentic compassion, it really begins to normalize discomfort, you know, and it normalizes discomfort, but it also shifts, you know, so when we shift the narrative around discomfort, then of course we enter into a space of normalizing discomfort, right? But it goes even further than that. I think that when we begin to normalize discomfort, we actually begin to offer like this really special, profound, important gift to people of allowing them to show up completely in the moment, you know?